Morning, brother, and welcome to another daily devotional. Before we turn to the passage of scripture that I want us to think about this morning and the next I will of our daily devotional series, I want to ask you a question. How much do you enjoy going to church? Or maybe I should put it another way. How much do you enjoy going to worship God? Is it something that you really look forward to? Something that you anticipate with desire each week? Imagine being in a situation where you were not able to go and worship anymore. Well, of course, to some degree, we know a little bit of what that's like. During the months of March and April and May, we were, of course, in lockdown and weren't able to go and physically meet with God's people. Thankfully now that is beginning to change and we can be with the people of God once again. But imagine if that went on for years and you weren't able to go to worship God with your fellow believers, you weren't able to meet with them and have fellowship with them and be encouraged by them. It would be a pretty dire situation if you just accepted that and it didn't really bother you that much. Whenever David was on the run from Saul, he wrote Psalm 61. Saul, of course, was jealous of David because he knew that David was going to end up being king, and he tried to thwart that by assassinating David. He chased him all over the country of Israel. And for years, David had to hide out as a fugitive in the wilderness, hiding in caves and so on, always on the run. And of course, that meant that he couldn't go to Jerusalem. And because he couldn't go to Jerusalem, he couldn't worship God with the people of God. And during this period in his life, he wrote Psalm 61. Listen to what he says. Hear my cry, O God, attend unto my prayer. From the end of the earth will I cry unto thee. When my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. For thou hast been a shelter for me and a strong tower from the enemy. And then he says this in verse 4, I will abide in thy tabernacle forever. I will abide in thy tabernacle forever. The temple, of course, had not been built at this stage. David's son Solomon would build a temple, and so God was worshipped in the tabernacle, the movable tent, which had been set up in Jerusalem. David, however, could not go and meet with God's people. It was too dangerous. He knew that if he set foot in Jerusalem, he would be assassinated. And so, unable to meet with God's people, David longed to be there. And here he expresses his desire. It's in the form of I will, but it can also be translated let me. Let me abide in thy tabernacle forever. I will abide in thy tabernacle forever. This is my desire, Lord. I want to be with your people. I want to be there when the sacrifices are offered. I want to be there when the priests are carrying out their duties. I want to be part of the people who are worshipping you. Of course, we don't have priests and we don't have sacrifices, and our worship is not confined to a building in Jerusalem that we have to travel hundreds and hundreds of miles in order to visit and to engage in the public worship of God. We're very privileged. We can meet in our local church buildings. God has said, where two or three are gathered in my name, you are there in the midst. And it is a joy and a delight for a person who is a Christian to be able to go and to meet with God's people each week. The desire that the psalmist expresses here is a desire that you and I should have in our hearts. This should strike a chord with you and me if we are children of God. I will abide in thy tabernacle forever. Not literally the tabernacle of which David speaks, but the place where God has said that he will meet with his people in order to receive their public worship. That's essentially what the tabernacle and later the temple was, and now the gathering of the church is. The place where God comes in a very special way among his people in order to receive their worship and indeed in order to bless them. As a child of God, it should be our desire to be at worship. Nothing hindering us, except, of course, circumstances over which we have no control. Perhaps we can't attend for a period of time due to ill health. Perhaps we can't attend for a period of time due to other factors. But it ought to be the case that for every child of God, whenever the church gathers for public worship, and that's usually on the Lord's Day, and it's morning and evening, not just morning, the people of God should want to be present. It's a sad thing that ministers have to coax people to come out to church, especially on a Sunday evening. Folks, if you love the Lord, you should be able to say, I will abide in thy tabernacle forever. Let me be able, Lord, to go to the place of worship, to be with my fellow believers, and to bring my worship to you, for you are worthy of all praise. May God help us to have the attitude to worship that we find in this 4th verse of Psalm 61. May God bless you today.